Hey guys, welcome back to another weekly update. Got a lot done this week, mostly following a theme of interactivity, and you'll see what I mean when I start going through the points here. Speaking of which, let's start off with our first one, exploding fire extinguishers. So the reason why I wanted to focus on interactivity this week is as I was filling out the levels, noticed that they were feeling better, they were flowing a little bit better. They were looking a bit more interesting with more sprites and a little bit um, extra added into the geometry, but they were kind of missing a little bit of something. So I started playing around a bit with some of the old build engine games and noticed that something that was really kind of a hallmark of them was that they were all very interactive. By that I mean that there was always something that you could shoot to break, especially in Blood, and there were little things that you could interact with just all over the place. So I wanted to kind of make that a little bit of a theme for this week and wanted to build that into the first two maps of the game so that as I build more maps, I have something to kind of look back on and set a standard early on. So, fire extinguishers, for instance, just a prop that can explode. It's fun to just blow things up, but the exploding fire extinguisher is a bit more functional than a lot of the other things. Like, you can shoot it, it blows up, deals damage to enemies, can deal damage to you, but can also do something like blow up destructible walls. I don't have that built into either of these levels so far. There's destructible walls in them, but not necessarily ones that you'll use a fire extinguisher to break open, but it's an option and something that I'm definitely looking into using. Next, we got breakable clocks added. So that's something else, just something to have fun with. Breaking things is something that you don't really notice until you don't have the ability to break anything. So I went through Blood, for instance, and so many of the props in that game can just be broken. You can run up and pitchfork even a rock in the first level, and it will break. Now, I'm not necessarily going to the level of breaking rocks, but I wanted to add in a lot more destructibles into the levels. So I made a lot of new ones, and then I adjusted some old ones and started putting them around the levels a little bit more. Still want to put more in, but it's definitely a big step up from what it was so far. More sprites. That is also a part of filling out the level, but not necessarily in a way of things that you need to have, but things that are just kind of fun to look at, things that help give the level a little bit more flavor and a little bit more identity. So, made a lot more of those and filled out the levels more. Soda machines, soda cans, and soda brands. These kind of all go together here, but I had to make them all individually. But soda machines, again, interactable. So you can interact with the soda machine and it will spit out a can. And I also made brands. So I have different brands of soda machine that will put out a different can based on the brand of machine. And I'm really happy with those ones actually. They're very functional from the editor as well. So they're just really nice to be able to put down. Just they're all pre-made very nicely for me, and I really like them. They're one of my favorite props that I've made so far, just because they're not necessarily all that advanced. In fact, they're really easy to make, but I feel like they are one of the more interactive props, and they're one of the more fitting props that just kind of feel right in the level. Really happy with how those turned out. And speaking of sprites, fixed a big issue with sprites. So the issue that I was running into with sprites before was that if I did something like I threw a Molotov at, let's just say, a tree, a sprite of a tree, or even an enemy, the sprite would always show up in front of the fire effect. And I noticed that happened with a lot of things, with explosions, with blood. And I essentially found out that the cause of it was translucent materials just don't really work correctly. they're weird. So translucent materials also have another issue that I was not aware of until I found the fix. So we'll go to the next point here for this. Fixed the issue by going to mostly masked sprites rather than translucent. So there is a subtle but very big difference between the two. Translucent materials can go from 0% opacity, so completely see-through, to 100%, which is, can't see through it at all, completely opaque. But it can go through like any percentage between those, so 0 to 100. Whereas masked sprites can only go 0 or 100. So it is either completely switched on or completely switched off, from a pixel standpoint anyway. And what I found with that was that fixed the issue. You can throw a Molotov at a sprite now, and the fire will show up in front of it and around it like it's supposed to. Blood shows up correctly, everything shows up correctly, but that's one big fix. But it came with a very nice bonus of having a massive performance increase. And for me, I had about 10 to 20 FPS extra in the editor. And that doesn't sound all that impressive, but that's in the editor. For instance, I would go from when I was in the editor before, I would have like maybe 80 to 90 frames on average in E1M1 in the editor. And then when I packaged the game, I was usually sitting around 160 or 170 FPS in the packaged game. So you get a massive increase once you're playing the packaged version of the game. So having that much of an increase in just the editor is hopefully going to translate to a pretty massive performance increase overall. So the reason for that is that the materials, they basically have to start packaging a lot of shaders into them based on how complex the material is. And so more shaders, more complex, more demanding from your computer. So with sprites that were translucent, a translucent material, I noticed eventually had something like, I think it was 42 shaders in it when I looked before. Whereas a masked sprite, if I didn't make it two-sided, which I did not, so it's a one-sided masked sprite, has one shader in it. So that basically means that for every sprite that I have now, one sprite before was using 42 times the performance. Which, I mean, it's just a sprite, but that pretty clearly adds up. There's a lot of sprites in this game. So pretty big performance increase there. Next up, light switches. It's like it sounds. You can flip lights on and off. And I'm able to assign groups of lights to a specific light switch. They work perfectly as far as I'm aware between saves and loads. Hopefully no one finds any bugs with those eventually. But it's just a little more interactive fun, and potentially some gameplay to be worked in there as well. And, make a room dark with enemies in it, and then it might be easier or harder depending on if you find a light switch or not. Next one, E1M2 additions. Mostly what it sounds like is just changing things up, like adding some sprites and things like that. Fixing some lights. Or destructibles. Yes, a lot. Added more sprites for that, for destructibles, so you'll have a little bit more fun with some of the sprites that are around the level. I added new types. So I try to assign kind of different effects to them and sounds based on what they're made of. So, I have metal, glass, ceramic, things like that. So just got a bit more variety there. Made a little bit of progress on E1M3. Finally, we finally actually managed to touch that map a little bit. I didn't get to do quite as much with it as I wanted to because of what's going to come up next. Not directly next, but at the end. Um, but yeah, made some progress there, which has been a long time coming. Made a little a fun little system. I don't want to spoil it, but it made a little fun system with a bell that you can ring. So as you play the game, you'll find that. Fixed sprites. So this is kind of connected to the sprite fix. It really is just kind of a thing with making a game where when you fix something, you will almost immediately after have to find a fix for your fix. So um, I found an issue where some sprites were not quite pitch black, but pretty damn close to it. And what was happening was, since I mentioned I made these sprites one sided instead of two sided, that means that one side works correctly with lighting and the other does not. So, it's a difference of having one shader in a material versus having two shaders in a material. Why not? I'm riding the performance high right now from the translucent materials, so I'm just trying to have a little bit extra success and squeeze out some efficiency where I can. There's no real drawback to it other than I just need to be a little bit more mindful of where I place lights, because sometimes, mostly with doors, and I actually kind of fixed the issue with the doors, but some sprites can act a little strangely if they have a light at a weird angle next to them, but as far as I can tell, I've fixed that so far. Next up is restructuring menus. This one's kind of difficult to explain. Basically, the issue started because I was under the impression that the player blueprint would not be loaded more than once. I thought the player blueprint would just be loaded in the game all the time. That is actually not the case. So I was creating the menus inside the player blueprint, which meant that every time that the player blueprint would load, it would create new menus, which is not normally an issue, but became an issue when it started running code more than once that it was not meant to run more than once. There's just certain code that if it runs multiple times, then it can kind of screw things up. So I was running into bugs with that. So I had to restructure the menus so that they were created outside of the player blueprint and done so in a way that wouldn't allow certain code to run more than once. Or at least could potentially run code more than once, but not in a way that would break things. It it was a whole lot of trial and error to fix these bugs, which is kind of related to the next point. The keybind display bug was fixed, which I'll talk about in a second. But the main thing is that the menus now are created they're outside of the player blueprint, and they are structured in a way that they have things handled kind of correctly. I tried before to have one blueprint do everything in the menus. Whereas now I have multiple blueprints doing handling basically what they should inside the blueprint. So it's more blueprints doing less in the menus, but doing so in a way that is efficient and handles it better. So it's a much more ideal setup. So the keybind display bug that was happening was you could rebind your key in the menu. So if you had, let's just say by default, forward is W, you click on the W, you hit Q so that Q will move you forward, and then you close the menu. You would open the menu again, and it would show Q like it's supposed to in the keybinds list. But if you loaded a save, or if you started a new game or loaded into a different level, then checked your keybinds, then it would be back to a W. The functionality wouldn't change. Q would still move forward, but the menu would show that it was W. So that essentially meant that I had to go back and change some things in the menus in a way that made it to where I was once again separating things out more so that things interact with each other less. And it sounds, I don't know if that maybe sounds obvious or counterintuitive, maybe a little bit of both, where if you have, my thought process was that if you had the keybinds change and then the key display change together, then if one worked, like if one worked, then the other one would be more likely to work. But instead, that just caused more problems than anything else. So it actually just works better, at least for me right now, to have them completely separate so that you have the keybinds separated from the display, the key being displayed. And the code does not interact between those whatsoever. And now it seems to work just fine. So that came with, well, really the restructuring of the menus came with the added benefit of that being fixed and other things being fixed and other things being a bit more functional now. So hopefully the menu bugs are dealt with. I have a feeling that when I do the next round of testing, we're going to wind up with bugs I never thought possible coming up, but we'll see. Hopefully not. Maybe I'll get lucky. But so that's it for this week. For next week, I'm going to be working a lot more on E1M1 and E1M2, still filling them out a little bit more, adding more interactable things like destructible sprites and things like that. Those are not necessarily E1M2 and E1M1 specific. Those can be reused later on. So one of those things where the longer I spend on these levels, it's not necessarily time taken away from others. So E1M3 might end up waiting. I might get a little bit more progress done on it this week, though. Blocking things out can always be done at pretty much any point. But you never know. About half of this week was eaten up by fixing the menus and fixing the sprites. So it may wind up being that I find some other bugs to fix this week and I don't get to do much on those levels, but we'll see. Ideally, we'll have E1M2 and E1M1 much more filled out and looking a lot more polished so that I can move on to E1M3 and start working on that more. But we'll find out next week how that goes. But for now, that's about it. So thank you for watching. I will see you guys next week. Thanks a lot, everybody. Have a good one.